Seeing Ourselves in Intellectual Freedom, a presentation to Dr. Tony Samek, LIS 592, Intellectual Freedom and Social Responsibility in Librarianship. Statement of Intent. This presentation will review the strengths of the statement and identify potential weaknesses in the document as it relates to our target audience of public library employees. We will define and examine the statement, look at how it informs library policy and procedures, consider options for strengthening the value of the statement, and finally, relate the statement to global trends and issues in librarianship. Library workers need the guidance offered by the statement in their workplaces. But in addition to its aspirational goals, they need solid policies to define the pragmatic boundaries of library work. Relevance to LIS 592. The statement forms the basic scaffolding for all discussions within LIS 592. As students and as individual librarians, we cannot establish a position on or a relationship to the tenet of intellectual freedom without first understanding how the term is defined and understood within the library community, which in this case is embodied in the coursework for LIS 592. If through this course we can come to understand the statement as a epistemic position out of which librarians can create policies and procedures, we can apply it in real-world situations. We can also critique the statement as a way of expanding our own knowledge of librarianship, concepts, and ideals. Contextualization of the statement on IF to LIS 592. The statement is one of the most significant pieces of Library Association rhetoric within the Canadian library profession. A close examination of the statement through the lens of a public library employee helps us to understand Canadian library and information professionals' roles in promoting and advocating for intellectual freedom. Purpose of the statement. When considering the purpose of the statement, first to mind is the way it outlines why intellectual freedom is important to library work and beyond. Furthermore, the statement suggests ways library professionals can bring intellectual freedom to life, as well as a cautionary statement on avoiding censorship. Although intellectual freedom is considered one of the most important foundational concepts underlying librarianship, it does not have one agreed upon definition. Gorman defines it quite broadly. But for librarianship, intellectual freedom is typically thought of as providing all individuals with the opportunity for freedom of expression and access to a diverse range of materials. As gateways to information, libraries play a key role in protecting the right to intellectual freedom, and this is reflected in the consistent use of the phrase core responsibility. Public libraries are often considered one of the last freely accessible places in which community members can learn, gather, and discuss. As we understand that access to information means access to power, it's important for libraries to provide this access equitably, thus supporting intellectual freedom. Framework of the statement. By outlining intellectual freedom for libraries, the statement, like other statements and ethical codes ascribed to the librarianship profession, creates a framework for library professionals' thoughts and practice. It's important to note, however, that professional statements like this are limited in their capabilities. For example, the inclusion and exclusion of certain language must be intentional, as otherwise the phrasing can create ambiguities or loopholes. Alvin Schrader, a key player in intellectual freedom in Canada and beyond, notes most libraries do adhere to the CFLA statements, including the Statement on Intellectual Freedom in libraries. This leads to an overarching and more actionable purpose of the statement, which is to inspire libraries to create their own informed statements and policies. Value of the statement. This purpose may be actualized as individual libraries openly support the statement in their own documents, use it to create their own statements on intellectual freedom, and/or use it to inform policies on collection development, room bookings, challenges, and more. Furthermore, Schrader notes that the statement can be used to inform job descriptions or training opportunities. Having this statement inform other intellectual freedom statements, policies, and core values helps shape the collective and individual value of intellectual freedom, whether through implicit or explicit knowledge. It also furthers the CFLA's larger purpose of advocating for the value of intellectual freedom in libraries and influencing public policy. In summary, while library professionals are bombarded by competing demands and limited resources, this statement looks to put intellectual freedom at the forefront of daily thoughts and actions. Audience. One of the core values of the CFLA is that intellectual freedom and free access to information is a key component of an open and democratic society. Thus, the statement is directed towards all persons living in Canada. This broad audience includes both individuals and groups as users of library services and resources. The scope of the audience is focused within the statement by addressing directly the goal of support for library employees, volunteers, and employers. This aligns with the mission of the CFLA to work in cooperation with all who share our values in order to present a unified voice on issues of mutual concern. Audience considerations. The statement gives audience consideration to the needs of the broad library sector. SAMIC notes that the CLA, predecessor of the CFLA, represented 5 constituent divisions. The objective of these distinct group representations is to ensure the voices and interests of academic, public, school, and special libraries, including those that govern the proceedings of libraries, in their role as trustees or board members. Intellectual freedom statement strengths. Schrader acknowledges intellectual freedom policy as the public library's institutional soul. Intellectual freedom underpins our rights as humans, our democracy, and the very foundation of what it means to be a public library. Without a keynote statement on intellectual freedom, the policies and procedures in place at public libraries across Canada, from privacy policies to collection development policies, and our work as public library professionals, would be fundamentally altered. What follows are examples of the interwoven nature of the statement throughout the global, national, and community-level policies that affect the work of public libraries across Canada. Strengths of the statement: human rights. National and international documents are highlighted by the statement. Both the UN's Declaration of Human Rights and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms are overtly named, with the statement going so far as to directly reflect the wording of both documents. Democracy. The IFLA's Public Library Manifesto notes that democracy is dependent on knowledge, thought, culture, and information. These key assets to a democratic society are also named within the statement, framing libraries as essential gateways for all Canadians. Public library policies. Intellectual freedom informs international and national issues. It is also essential to public library policy development at the community level. In fact, Schrader believes that library boards should be using the statement as high beams illuminating the roadway ahead. There are multiple examples of policies from Edmonton Public Libraries, available policies, that have the statement woven through them. For example, EPL's collection development policy directly references the statement and mimics similar wording. The same can be seen in the room booking policy for EPL, as well as the CFLA's position on third-party use of library rooms, which is also currently linked within the statement on intellectual freedom. In addition, the statement explicitly mentions the privacy of library users. EPL has a privacy policy for customer information. RUB notes that if privacy is lacking, an individual may alter their information-seeking behavior, and therefore their right to information has become compromised. According to the statement, libraries are key institutions in Canada for rendering expressive content accessible and affordable to all. This encompasses content of all formats, including online content. The CFLA has a statement on internet use, and EPL has incorporated that statement into its own policy on public internet access. In conclusion, one can see that the statement is a solid foundation and forms the roots of many related CFLA statements and public library policies. We need this solid foundation to continue to support and grow the library's commitment to intellectual freedom. Weaknesses in the statement. Given the foundational nature of the statement and its influence on policy creation, public library workers must be able to see themselves and their practice reflected in it. The statement is unequivocal about the role of individual library staff as key players in the institution's ability to uphold and ensure the right to intellectual freedom of its patrons. And yet, as an unregulated profession, there is no articulation of the way in which library staff, who go out on a limb in defense of these values, will be protected or supported. The statement lacks the legal teeth to protect staff, making the statement one of aspiration as opposed to regulation. As we are unable to predict how the reasonable limits of prescribed by law, described in Section 1 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, will be applied, and with no regulatory body providing support to professionals in the field, it is vital that staff have a clear understanding of their obligations and the potential ramifications of their actions in defense of intellectual freedom. Finding the roots of intellectual freedom. Public library workers should be able to see clearly the link between the roots of intellectual freedom and the branches as they relate to the sister documents, including but not limited to the position statements on diversity and inclusion and third-party room bookings, the Code of Ethics, Truth and Reconciliation Report and Recommendations, and the more recent position paper on protest and disagreement related to collections, programs, and speakers in libraries. For this reason, we recommend that the statement more explicitly connect and point to these documents as they inform the day-to-day practice and policies of public library staff. In addition, at the individual library level, more emphasis should be placed on staff training around both the content of these documents and the ways in which they connect to and are rooted in intellectual freedom. Despite the expectation that library workers form the first line of defense when it comes to protecting the right to intellectual freedom of their patrons, it is worth noting that they do not, in most cases, enjoy the same level of freedom of expression in the workplace. The more that employees understand intellectual freedom and how it is reflected in their institution's policy, the greater confidence they can have in their daily decisions at work and in calling for change and support from their communities, employers, and unions. Employees who understand intellectual freedom can understand the responsibilities that go along with it and be empowered to respond to and navigate issues present across public libraries. Embedding the statement in collective agreements is one way in which the employer and the union can agree to be governed by the statement, in addition to guaranteeing employees' rights to freedom of expression. This was achieved by the Saskatoon Public Library. Referencing expectations for applicants' professional commitment to intellectual freedom, was successfully integrated by the Edmonton Public Library. CFLA should follow through on adopting a workplace speech addendum that is backed with support to help interpret and clarify the borders of intellectual freedom for library workers. Global issues and rhetoric. Public library employees are dealing with both familiar and new challenges to intellectual freedom. The statement can be a helpful guidepost to interpret these issues and inform responses. The COVID-19 pandemic has placed demands on workers to distribute disinformation. Third-party facility bookings related to the pandemic and vaccinations have led to disagreements, protests, and calls for censorship. In the past year, the United States has faced increasing book challenges, primarily for materials by and for Black and LGBTQ communities. The racial justice movement that surged in the summer of 2020 has led to questions, demands, and backlash regarding libraries' commitment to anti-racism in their collections, programs, and policies. In conclusion, what we need as library professionals is a greater awareness of intellectual freedom and how it pervades the entirety of our profession. Through education, training, and a deeper understanding of the interconnectedness intellectual freedom plays in librarianship, we as employees will be better supported in how we do our jobs. Looking to the future, intellectual freedom must flow throughout workplace speech policies, hiring directives, and collective agreements. Who is who, and what did we do? This presentation was an opportunity for the following LIS 592 students to learn, unlearn, and relearn together. This included Elsie Baker and Lauren Bell, Elena Plotnikoff and Sandra Sador, Erin Wilson and Karen Wooten. We invite you to peruse our references and works cited. Thank you.